Bom dia. Com muito prazer que nós iniciamos agora, com um pouco de atraso, o nosso quinto evento, o nosso quinto Colóquio Estéticas no Centro, cujo tema dessa edição é Dimensões do Estético. Essa abertura vai ser bem breve, eu só gostaria de dizer que o evento é semipresencial, ou seja, vocês podem acessar pelo canal do YouTube da UFG, os links estão no site do evento, e também podem ir presencialmente ao auditório da FAFIL, no campus Samambaia da UFG. Então, eu queria muito agradecer a presença de todas e todos, dos inscritos, dos palestrantes. É um colóquio internacional, nós já contamos aqui com a primeira palestrante, que é a Monique Roelofs, da Universidade de Amsterdã, que falará logo em seguida essa breve apresentação. Junto comigo estão outros organizadores, como Miguel Gali, da UNB, a Rita Márcia Furtado, da Faculdade de Educação, a Alice, que está nos bastidores, a Alice Martins, que é da FAV, e o coordenador da pós-graduação da FAFIL, que é o Ricardo Della Vecchia, e o Anderson, que é o nosso diretor da Faculdade de Filosofia, que está aqui presente também. Então, eu peço que vocês digam algumas palavras de abertura e já desejando um excelente encontro, intenso encontro de 3 dias para vocês.
Bom dia a todas e todos. Desejo um excelente evento, maravilhoso ver a programação aqui. Parabéns a todas que estão participando da organização, especialmente a Carla, Damião, e a FAFIL apoia e está muito contente com a realização desse evento.
Bom dia a todos e todos. Eu agradeço o convite para participar de mais uma edição do Colóquio Internacional de Estética, convite da professora Carla Milani Damião. É uma alegria, um prazer e uma honra estarmos aqui nesse diálogo bastante profícuo entre filosofia, educação, artes visuais, antropologia. Eu penso que é uma excelente oportunidade para discutirmos as estéticas decoloniais que vêm se constituindo ao longo desses anos. Nós começamos com as confluências, né? A primeira edição, em 2016, que a professora Carla organiza, confluindo tradições estéticas, e agora nessa edição, assim, nessa necessidade mesmo de discutirmos essas novas possibilidades nesse campo. Sejam todos, todas, todos bem-vindos ao colóquio.
Bom dia a todas as pessoas que nos acompanham. A minha presença aqui na condição de coordenador é mais protocolar, uma vez que o PPG-FIL foi representado pela professora Carla Damião, que não apenas organizou, né, juntamente com o professor Miguel Gali, o pessoal da FAB, este evento. Mais do que organizar, o que a gente percebe nos eventos que a Carla conduz é uma verdadeira curadoria, né, que tem um propósito, um engajamento sempre muito bem pensado. Então, eu quero apenas parabenizar e dizer que estou interessado na programação, vou acompanhar tudo que for possível. Bom evento a todos e todas.
Bom dia a todos, todos. Eu queria cumprimentar o Anderson, diretor da faculdade, o Ricardo, coordenador do programa, a Rita, que está lá no auditório. Eu devia estar lá com ela, mas à tarde eu estou chegando, viu, Rita? Para render aí e dividir essa responsabilidade. Quero cumprimentar a professora Monique Roelofs. Hello, Monique, so just say that you are welcome. E também a Carla, que conduziu com muita coragem essa edição, né, o 5º Colóquio Internacional Estéticas no Centro, porque nós tivemos um apoio, né, que a gente merece, por causa do tempo, por causa das condições políticas atuais e tal. Então, eu queria parabenizar, sobretudo, a Carla, que conduziu, coordenou com maestria, e esse evento realmente está organizando hoje, está sendo realizado hoje, né? Então, eu desejo a todos um ótimo evento e uma boa palestra. Tenho certeza que a gente vai aproveitar bastante as falas da Monique, são sempre instigantes e tem tudo a ver, né? Ótima abertura para a gente retomar e explorar esse tema das estéticas decoloniais. Bom evento a todos.
Obrigada, então, os colegas, e agora a gente vai dar início à primeira conferência da professora Monique Roelofs, a quem eu faço agora uma breve apresentação, embora ela já tenha participado do segundo evento que foi organizado aqui na FAFIL, Estética em Preto e Branco, né? Foi quando eu a conheci e, por meio da leitura de seus textos, eu a convidei e, desde então, a gente estabelece um bom diálogo. Eu vou rapidamente apresentá-la, para quem não a conhece. A professora Monique Roelofs, desculpa, uma pequena interferência aqui. Ela é professora na Universidade, na Faculdade de Filosofia e Arte e Cultura da Universidade de Amsterdã. Sua pesquisa explora a relação entre estética e política, com foco especial nas dinâmicas de raça, gênero, colonialidade e o global. Ela é autora de alguns livros, entre os quais a Promessa Cultural do Estético, que foi publicado em 2014, e deve sair a tradução desse livro no próximo ano aqui no Brasil. Ela concluiu recentemente um outro livro, cujo título é Aesthetics, a Dress and the Politics of Culture. É também coautora de um livro com parceiros da América Latina, pensando a questão da temporalidade e das artes sempre. Também é coeditora da coleção Black Art and Aesthetics, Relacionalidades, Interioridades e Estimativas. E sua pesquisa estende-se pelas áreas da teoria racial feminista e crítica, do pensamento decolonial e da teoria crítica e política, interessada na intersecção de tradições continentais e analíticas. As estruturas conceituais desse interesse reúnem estética e teoria cultural crítica, que sustentam questões como a publicidade do juízo estético, identidade, normatividade, leitura crítica e as relações entre a arte e seu público. Ela aborda esses temas envolvendo-se com as complexidades da experiência estética, conforme se formam em nossos encontros cotidianos dentro e fora do mundo da arte. Entre outras experiências profissionais, ela teve um período nos Estados Unidos como professora e, desde então, 2019, atua na Universidade de Amsterdã, também coordenando um programa de teoria crítica cultural, o seminário Film Philosophy, e também atua como curadora da American Society for Aesthetics de 2019 ao presente. Então, dito isso, eu preparei uma tradução da fala da professora, que será em inglês. Sorry for the long introduction, Monique. We'll try now to start the presentation, showing the translation. And I'm not in the control because the studio is showing, but if you could speak slowly with a pause, they can follow you and scroll up, down the text while you talk, right? So thank you again very much for your for being with us remotely, and I hope you can come here next time presentially, and we can see and hear you live, really live for everyone. Thank you very much for your coming.
Gracias, Carla. Muchas gracias para las introducciones y muchas gracias a Miguel Galí y Carla para la organización de esta conferencia. Un gran placer estar aquí. En julio estaré en Brasil con vosotros, pero ahora es un placer estar aquí en la distancia. Carla, ¿todo está bien con la tecnología?
Sí, sí.
Vale. Aesthetics stands in a complex relation to conditions of coloniality, race, and gender. Theorists such as Sylvia Wynter, Edouard Glissant, and Gloria Anzaldúa recognize the contributions of aesthetic practices to formations of Western hegemony, while simultaneously insisting on the crucial world-making capacities of aesthetic agency and creativity. Wynter underscores the need for an aesthetic model that fosters modes of being, knowing, and freedom that surpass Western overdeterminations of the human. Glissant articulates a poetics that energizes relationality to correct colonialist and ethnocentric delimitations of identity. Anzaldúa describes a genre of border art that suspends binary oppositions among US, Mexican, and indigenous cultures and the implicit hierarchies entailed by these oppositions. While critiquing Western aesthetics on the grounds of its exclusionary workings, these scholars also mark an important role for aesthetics as a critical practice. What does this coincidence of contradictory social forces and values entail for the notion of the aesthetic domain? The aesthetic, I argue, in the cultural promise of the aesthetic, is an assembly of conceptually inflected, socially situated, multimodal, embodied practices. It involves a kind of normativity, aesthetic normativity, which, while participating in social, political, and economic criteria and values, also exceeds these dimensions and cannot be reduced to them. In this normative field, we develop and make use of aesthetic judgments that give expression to forms of appraisal that often make reference to dimensions of pleasure or displeasure. We find perceptual and emotional guidance or orientation in aesthetic concepts and values, such as the beautiful, the sublime, and the grotesque. These kinds of judgments, concepts, and values, however, do not exhaust the field of aesthetic normativity, for we're dealing with an array of socially embedded practices. Indeed, delving into the evolving and often contradictory sphere of aesthetic experience, a different array of central phenomena comes to light, the unfoldings of forms of relationality and address, including what I call aesthetic promises and threats. I understand the aesthetic, in short, as a set of practices of relationality, address, and promises or threats. With this ontology, I seek to capture the open-ended dynamics of aesthetic normativity, meaning, and desire. This view offers a framework for recognizing how social, economic, and political conditions, such as racial capitalism, gender oppression, and forces of democratization or democratic backsliding, both impact and take form in aesthetic territory. At the same time, political institutions and the marketplace irrevocably fail to enclose the aesthetic definitively within configurations of ideology, hegemony, or resistance. The procedures of relationality, address, and promising, threatening, surpass such determinations. The plane of mutually convening forces that becomes visible when we combine Wynter's Glissant's and Ansaldo's insistence on the problems, as well as the critical potentialities of the aesthetic, is instructive. Instead of jettisoning the aesthetic on account of its ties to social power or discounting these ties, we need a theory of the ambivalent workings of aesthetic power. Instead of dismissing the aesthetic as a force of injustice, we need to think through its ties to justice and injustice alike. Instead of associating the aesthetic in a closed fashion with the accounts of it provided by philosophers such as Shaftesbury, Hume, Burke, Kant, Schiller, and the like, we need to sort out what useful insights these thinkers might have to offer about aesthetic normativity. In their writings, I find configurations of relationality, address, and promises/threats that embody morally and politically ambivalent values and meanings. These values and meanings coagulate around social positions of race, gender, class, nation, sexuality, and coloniality. We see, for example, that whiteness constitutes a promise for Kant and Hume, a condition to be fostered through aesthetic means, and blackness a threat, a condition to be averted through aesthetic means. These philosophers thus support trajectories of what I call aesthetic racialization and racialized aestheticization. Explicit ideals of human equality that place humans on an equal footing as possible participants in aesthetic practices go together in their texts with valorizations of aesthetically produced inequality that applaud culture insofar as it exemplifies white masculinity and deprecate it insofar as it's associated with male and female blackness and indigeneity. With the notions of aesthetic racialization and racialized aestheticization and their affiliate notions of aesthetic gendering and gendered aestheticization, I describe cultural strategies that we can discern in these historical thinkers and that at the same time play a prominent part in the contemporary cultural field. The relevant racial and gender forces do not follow their own independent course. In an intersectional fashion, these strategies reach into each other and into class positionalities along with other dimensions of difference. This means that aesthetic racialization also entails aesthetic gendering and the aesthetic realization of alignments of sexuality, class, coloniality, nation, ability, disability, and so forth. Recent political theater in Brazil provides an example. Right-wing displays of speed and technological prowess in the last years, such as Bolsonaro's recurrent motorcycle rallies in São Paulo, support processes of cultural change that favor economically privileged white classes and masculinist forms of control over the society and nature along modern colonial lines. The parades engage in a process of aesthetic racialization that posits white hegemony as a vantage point. They aestheticize this organization of power as fast, strong, and tough. They also draw on a vast historical repertoire of aesthetic tropes, connoting combativeness, spectacles of virility, and forward-looking manifestations of white state power, such as a conqueror's triumphal entry into a vanquished city, or an ostentatious show of military vehicles. Alluding to such widely established signifiers, the motorcades arguably enact a trajectory of racialized aestheticization, which they employ in the service of the project of aesthetic racialization that I already mentioned. Buoyed by these intertwining modalities, Bolsonarismo establishes itself as a movement that's deeply ensconced in white culture. Aesthetic promises of freedom and unfettered happiness and aesthetic threats of domination, repression, and violence are powerful elements of this cultural vision. We navigate cultural territory by way of these promises and their attendant threats. Piensa en la ambivalencia de los colores amarillo y verde ahora, hoy juntos, los colores juntos, como símbolos en las calles y también el color naranja, por supuesto, muy peligroso, grande amenaza, promesas también. Aesthetic promises point to what culture can be and become. They gesture toward the kinds of values and social arrangements cultures can instantiate. The notion of aesthetic promising signals how such possibilities can motivate our aesthetic actions and interpretations and draw us to aesthetic objects. Aesthetic promises acquire their meanings in the interchange between aesthetic makers, perceivers, and objects. They emerge in the context of forces of reciprocal animation between these poles of aesthetic exchange. An example of this can be found in Pablo Neruda's Elemental Odes, in which the speaker addresses everyday objects, such as apples, spoons, bread, kaki, and in the same gesture addresses his fellow human beings who also stand in relations of address to these things. The speaker's address to the objects supports webs of harmonious and egalitarian relationships between actors and things, and by extension, among actors present, past, and future. Reciprocal bonds of animation unfold. The odes bring to expression a promise of culture inherent in the aesthetic. To consider another example, in The Hour of the Star, Clarice Lispector dismantles numerous aesthetic promises, such as beauty's promise of happiness. Shaping the aesthetic life world, harboring protagonist Macabea and writer character Rodrigues SM, who struggles mightily to compose her story, these promises collapse in view of the racial, gender, and class problems that traverse the aesthetic field. The novel refuses to offer a solution for these difficulties. Instead, it explicitly leaves it to the reader, you, to do this job. But it doesn't present this challenge without also offering a promise. As a work of literature, the novel embodies the promise that reading it will be an aesthetically worthwhile activity. This promise offers the reader a basis for taking up the novel's moral, political, and aesthetic calling by building further aesthetic promises. In the collaboration between work and reader, the promise of valuable reading incites a promise of crafting new promises for the work and of finding in the ruins of abandoned aesthetic promises resources for assembling new ones, including cultural promises of the aesthetic. The reader is prompted to search for new ways of building a public we, ways that take into consideration the lived reality of subaltern aesthetic actor Macabea. Taking up the novel's challenge, we can then retool the promise of the generalized public envisioned by Kant and Hume into a promise of a differently constituted we, forged in encounters among different aesthetic systems. I believe that we often rewrite aesthetic promises in analogous ways. I couple this insight with a tweaked and hedged understanding of Adorno's notion of art's broken promise. Yes, we break aesthetic promises, but we also give ourselves over to such promises and place great value in them. In engagement with Arendt's and Nietzsche's view of the social significance of the promise, I highlight the continuity as well as the discontinuity of this phenomenon and underscore its ties to identity. Promising is a facet of the construction of meaning and the organization of desire in the aesthetic field. It's anchored in structures of multimodal address, which enact norms and forms of address that play out in scenes and scripts of address. It's in this context of the workings of address that aesthetic promises lock into practices of racialized aestheticization and aesthetic racialization. I now turn to a recent sculptural installation to further explore the ties between a promise of culture, constellations of public address, and trajectories of racialized aestheticization and aesthetic racialization. Mira la scultura. In 2019, Kenyan-American artist Wangechi Mutu placed 4 caryatids in the niches of the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which up to that point had remained empty. Titled "The Nuance Will Free Us," the installation made an aesthetic promise. It was an old aesthetic promise, a promise of freedom, but in a conjunction of African and Western idioms. The passers-by on Fifth Avenue sidewalk or in the bus could also intuit a powerful new aesthetic promise. Those who invent novel styles, initiate unforeseen bodily perspectives, and take up previously unoccupied stances in the world are singled out by the four statues as the ones who will initiate a path toward freedom. This path ties into justice, for in the altered imaginary of the new classical facade that the installation provokes, persons historically held back by forces of race and gender are the first to meet the museum visitor. Unos más imágenes en el próximo página. Las cuatro esculturas. Podemos continuar con el texto. Gracias. Sitting tranquilly, the figures, named seated 1, 2, 3, and 4, in the artist's terms, are at home on their pedestals in front of the museum. They belong where they are. They frame the institution and guide the viewer's approach to the extraordinary collection of cultural objects held in the building. The us of the title, we can imagine, becomes a radically inclusive community. A we is animated, that encompasses Black women while also extending to the culture at large. The question of the culture and the people making up the we for Mutu ties into matters of representation and address. The idea of asking a contemporary artist to place something in there that is about the issues of today is a statement in and of itself. It's saying, listen, we're willing to talk about what we're going through as a culture and as a people, and we're willing to put you in that position as the bearer of these ideas in front of this institution. These institutions are us, you know, they represent who we are. For me, it's not only a privilege, it's also addressing and admitting that, yes, ¿todo bien? Espero que todo está bien. Carla, dime por el teléfono, por favor. Imagino que todo está bien, ¿sí? Vale. A we is animated that encompasses Black women while also extending to the culture at large. Sorry, I already said that. Okay. So, al final de la quotation, these institutions are us, you know, they represent who we are. For me, it's not only a privilege, it's also addressing and admitting that, yes, we have to change up who we use to represent us as a museum, as a space that speaks to all of these different people who visit the city. Who we use to represent us as a museum, as a space that speaks to all of these different people who visit the city. Forma de representación, de enderezamiento. ¿Vale? The four figures propose a novel representation of the we put forth by the museum as a whole. They address this revised notion of who we are to a broadened audience as a part of a dialogue about the large questions we face in the current era. In their concern with the people's lives and the profound issues we're up against, the caryatids enact a cultural promise. This is the promise that, guided by the new ones, we can build a racially and gender inclusive society, and moreover, that aesthetic existence revolving around forms of address that we realize in and beyond the museum and in relation to the work can be instrumental in fostering such a society. Culture, we realized as we look at the sculptures, is not defined by restrictive ideas about the we historically embedded in Western archives and texts, but entails far more encompassing notions of the people, ones that posit greater equality and heterogeneity. Mutu's work inhabits culture in this sense and renders the viewer a part of it. As a dimension of her aesthetic experience, the viewer imbibes the promise of an aesthetically sustained, equal, free, and multifocal society that is to come, prefigured by the outlooks and bodily comportments of the nuance. The aesthetic promises that Mutu's installation enacts is philosophically significant. It points to a ubiquitous phenomenon, as I already indicated. So let's reflect a bit further on this phenomenon. Aesthetic promises suggest the idea that an artwork or other aesthetic practice can offer insight or contribute to the realization of freedom and happiness, are anchored in institutions and encoded in delineations of space, time, and sociality. They are part of the ways in which we care about aesthetic objects and engage in relationships with them. As subjects of cultures, we organize our aesthetic experiences and relationships in part around such promises. Promises are forms of address that draw us toward artworks and everyday aesthetic forms. Along with motive, relationality, and address, they are elements of an aesthetic ontology, as I already indicated. Indeed, a view that sees these elements as central constituents of the aesthetic sheds light on the ties of the aesthetic with identifications and disidentifications that we fashion around notions of race, gender, and coloniality, both in historical Western accounts and in newly emerging alternative configurations. Rather than positing stark dualities between center and periphery, colonizer and colonized, oppressor and oppressed, global north and south, this view brings to light evolving cultural formations in which intersectional differences and identity take novel forms. Indeed, aesthetic promises, including promises of culture, I argue, lie at the heart of an expansive range of aesthetically saturated cultural formations that include certain national and regional cultures envisaged by 18th century philosophy, but also reach far beyond this to encompass other types of micro and macro level identifications and differentiations and their mutual repercussions and interconnections. These formations invite a fine-grained picture of motive aesthetic collectivity that are under formation and that do not admit of exhaustive or defining mappings. The relationality and flexibility of promising lends itself to theorizing a network of mobile, intermeshing systems of aesthetic affiliation and disaffiliation, appropriation, and disowning. Culture operates at these levels of aesthetic practice. Mutu's installation offers points of identification to persons whose membership in social institutions is contested on account of geographical, racial, gender, and class considerations. The work participates in an institutional shift toward decoloniality. With courage and beauty, the nuance will free us, engages the vast difficulties we're going through as a culture and as a people, as Mutu puts it. The museum and the nuance are interlocutors in debates about these momentous problems. While Mutu's installation holds out a promise, it withholds a solution to the deep and abiding problems it recognizes. We saw an analogous situation in the case of Lee Specker's novel. The answers have to come to a significant extent from us, from the passers-by in the street or on the bus, from the museum public or from the viewers who learn about the work in other forums. The installation acknowledges this by affirming the labor of the many whom it already counts among the nuance, as Mutu points out, climate activists, participants in Black Lives Matter movements, teachers, gender, sexual, and racial minorities who fight for equity. It then befalls to the people and the society rather than to the artwork alone to make the promise come through. This is part of the logic of aesthetic promises. They posit a structure of collaboration on which they rely for their realization. The promise in Mutu's cultures has a flip side. Insofar as the installation subscribes to the idea of a group of visionaries endowed with the power to free us, it conveys an implicit threat alongside the promise. For clearly, the danger arises that the path toward freedom entails exclusions in its own right. Crucial cultural needs may be dismissed or ignored on the way to the more inclusive society. The process of change may leave categories of people unaddressed and barred from entering the dialogue. This possibility is foreshadowed by Mutu's allusion to the different visitors of New York City. Obviously, not everyone is included in this category. These kinds of obstacles do not come as a surprise in aesthetic territory. As already mentioned, aesthetic promises go together with threats. We navigate a field of aesthetic tensions and ambivalences where both modes of address are in action. Indeed, we organize our aesthetic relationships in part around promises and threats that we discern and lend multisensory, intercorporeal forms of articulation. Entangled in this thicket of mutually countervailing aesthetic forces, how do we stay clear of an impasse? With the idea of a collaborative bodily and material process of manufacturing promises and threats, I have in mind a fundamentally open process of relation making that we engage in as cultural actors. Embracing this openness, Mutu's work avoids becoming stranded in a deadlock between a promise of culture and its correlative threat. Adorned with shiny discs based on surma and Makonde embellishment and sourced in radiantly colored bronze coilings and strings, the 4 female statues, which appear to be at once human and otherworldly, receive the sunlight to reflect it back into their environment. Lines of reciprocal animation arise between the nuance and the people, the city space, non-human beings, and the cosmos at large. The placement of the plates in front of eye, mouth, and forehead, and behind the back of the head, signals a diversion or halting of ordinary significatory modes. Established forms of seeing, speaking, thinking, and appearing are supplanted by emissions and receptions that transcend the scope of the usual senses and outpace the bandwidth of common conceptualizations. Note how the coils and drapes of the statues energetically spill over feet and knees into the pedestals, feeding, as it were, the statue's stone base, while in turn being fed by it. Endowed with extraordinary receptors and emitters of address, the figures project a revised constellation of aesthetic publicity into which they call the spectator. The museum is a part of this circuit, but like the city, the cosmos, the 4 figures, the viewer, and their fellow humans and non-human entities, it occupies a position in reordered patterns of reciprocal animation. We imagine a re-energized web of aesthetic relationships among these participants. The installation beckons with the potentialities of a decolonial aesthetic world. Unprecedented connections emerge between the different sides of aesthetic invention that contribute their forms to the installation: the Metropolitan Museum of Art, settings high above the earth and deeply below the ground, and locations in Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Sudan. The flow spinning through these sites when senses and gender trajectories of freedom that we can dip into to give new form to a revisioned we. Aesthetic racialization and gendering, and racialized and gendered aestheticization in this vision circumvent normalized hierarchies to enter into more egalitarian relational alignments. Neither fully part of the museum nor external to it, Mutu's sculptures take up a liminal position between structures of address. The installation puts forth a form of aesthetic publicity that, while grafting itself onto the museum and city space, splendidly displaces and reimagines these delineations. From the point of view of this forum, we can rethink dynamics of address, including the norms, forms, scenes, and scripts they imply. Rather than dispelling threats, this public forum comprises a space where aesthetic actors, in the course of a process of becoming, can critically engage both promises and threats. Mutu's piece enacts a decolonial aesthetics that posits a novel structure of public address. Of special note here is that her work reaches beyond aesthesis, understood as modalities of perception, imagination, and emotion, and often emphasized by decolonial theorists, to call attention to this public forum. Positions of address in this forum reflexively feed back into themselves and each other. People and things shift in relation to one another, as illustrated by the cycles of reciprocal animation the work projects among statues, viewers, sun, skies, streets, and buildings. Although Enlightenment scholars have wrongly construed aesthetic subjectivity in wide terms, they were right to understand artworks and their audiences as occupants and inhabitants of public structures of address. Mutu's installation insists on a rethinking of existent public spaces in order to bring into being decolonial promises that are yet to be invented and to engender new callings toward a we. The convergence of conflictual social forces and values we see in Winter's, Glissant's, and Ansaldou's aesthetics takes place within and among structures of aesthetic publicity that are under formation by artworks and their audiences. Muchas gracias. Eso es. Carla, ¿todo bien? Creo que hay un problema con la conexión, pero tal vez la gente puede enviar las preguntas a Carla por el chat o a Miguel. Y puedo... Porque me gustaría... Carla, ¿podemos comunicar las preguntas por el teléfono, por tal vez, o con Miguel. Miguel, ¿puedes darme tu número de teléfono? Si alguien puede llamarme per teléfono, puedo dar respuesta.
Okay, can you listen? All right. Well, it was a technical problem. I'm so sorry. Monique, thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. There was, I love it, and I think everyone appreciated it very much because it brings me back to the cultural, the cultural promise of the aesthetic, and with new in new context, and you brought for us our own picture of at the beginning of the text about Bolsonaro's defeated almost ex-president and his motociatas, that's how we call here, his rallies, and what that means about being white and pretending to be powerful and to keep this kind of horrible view for people that are not, that really threat people and put everyone apart. And in this other, this artwork that you brought, so it was a wonderful, I don't want to say example, but it brought so much. And I would like to ask you something, but first, let's see if there are questions. And I don't have the access to the chat, and but I believe people are still thinking about their reading and not and follow your presentation. But anyway, I'm so sorry for the problems we had, the technical problems, and this took a little bit from our time. And I just wish you could stay longer and talk to us. But can we leave for other time? So next year, maybe you can come back and we'll talk and discuss longer. Sorry.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, and we'll see if there are any questions that I couldn't see here in the chat. I'll send to you, and we can talk further in other occasions when you visit us next year, maybe. Thank you very much.
Que tengas una buena conferencia, espero. Chao.
Ciao. Thank you.
Chao.